Thank you. Well, I'm going to give you the same lecture that I gave to the Cambridge City Hospital in 1979. I've been giving the same lecture ever since. It's very boring. But it's important that you'll understand the medical implications of the nuclear fuel chain, right from uranium mining all the way through to nuclear weapons. Because we're not taught this in medical school. We should be, because if there's a meltdown near here and you've got 3 old reactors, you will be dealing with contaminated patients. And you won't know what to do with them. You won't want to touch them. You will not be able to remove the internal emitters in their bodies. And so I need to walk you through all of this. And this should be imperative in the curriculum in all medical schools. In fact, it was during the 80s and where we talked... No, I want full house lights, please. Thanks, Joel. Taught everyone about the medical effects of nuclear war. Okay, let's go. Uranium is the raw material for nuclear weapons and for nuclear power. It's got 2 isotopes, 235 and 238. This is the fissionable one. There are only 2 fissionable elements, really, plutonium-239, which is what most of your bombs are made of, and 235, uranium. This is present in 0.7%. It must be enriched to 3% for use in reactors, like yours close by, or over 50% or more, and you've got bomb-grade material. And the Non-Proliferation Treaty says that every country can have nuclear power if they want. They can have all the technology that goes with it, including uranium enrichment. So what Iran is doing at the moment is totally internationally legal. They're allowed to enrich uranium. And there's no evidence, according to your 16 intelligence agencies, that she's building a bomb. I'll talk about that in a minute because it's very important if Iran is bombed. Okay, so the stuff left behind is called depleted uranium. It's 1.7 times more dense than lead, and as mass equals velocity by momentum equals velocity by mass, if you turn this into anti-tank shells, they're very effective and they slice through the tank armor like a hot knife through butter. But they're pyrophoric, so when they hit the tank, 80% of it burns and produces tiny aerosolized particles less than 5 microns, which are inhaled into the terminal bronchi. This is very radioactive. It's an alpha emitter. There are basically 5 sorts of radiations, X-rays, and where the biggest irradiators are the public. Now, I just interestingly read an article in the radiological literature a couple of days ago that people who have a lot of dental X-rays have a higher incidence of brain cancer. We must be careful. CT scans give you a hell of a dose too. We all know that all radiation is dangerous. Each dose is cumulative and it adds to the risk of getting cancer. Don't walk through the X-ray machines at the airports. In fact, they should be obliterated. Fetuses are thousands of times more radiosensitive than adults. 1 X-ray to the pregnant abdomen doubles the incidence of leukemia in that child. Children are 10 to 20 times more radiosensitive than adults, and little girls are twice as sensitive as little boys, and we don't know why. Women are 50% more sensitive to the carcinogenic effects of radiation than men. We don't know why either. Perhaps we're the more sensitive sex. Okay, gamma radiation is given off by various isotopes or daughters of uranium and by various isotopes made in reactors, same as X-rays, non-particulate. Alpha radiation is composed of 2 protons and 2 neutrons emitted from an unstable atom. You can hold an alpha emitter like uranium in your hand and it doesn't penetrate the layers of dead cells in the epidermis to damage living cells. They say don't worry about alpha emitters like plutonium because a piece of paper stops the alpha particle. However, if it's in your lung, the surrounding cells get a very high dose. It's 10 times more effective radiologically than X-rays or gamma rays. And so within that volume that's affected by the alpha radiation, most cells die. But as radiation decreases with the square of the distance on the periphery, cells remain viable. The regulatory genes are mutated. Hence, less than a microgram or 10 to the minus 6 grams of plutonium is carcinogenic, and uranium is very carcinogenic. And it's an alpha emitter. And the uranium that I'm talking about that are used for these anti-tank shells has a half-life of 4.5 billion years. Beta radiation is just an electron emitted from an unstable atom. They all do the same thing. And I talk about these shells because you've used 360 tons of this so-called ordnance in Basra, and you've used a hell of a lot in Fallujah. The incidence of severe congenital anomalies, anencephaly, phocomelia, cyclops, neural tube defects has gone up 25% in Fallujah, so much so that the doctors have told the women to stop having babies. But that means to stop having babies for 4.5 billion years, because the whole area is contaminated. And America's conducting a nuclear war in Iraq, and has done so, and in Afghanistan, and in Bosnia. And I wrote an article for the New York Times about this, and they would not publish it. A medical article. They do publish my articles, but they didn't publish this one. The other thing is the incidence of childhood cancer has gone up drastically, and because of the sanctions, we, paediatricians, or our colleagues, can't treat the patients because they have no drugs. And I got an urgent call the other day to see if I could get the new drug is for acute leukemia, and I can't remember the name of it. Anyway, I met the man who developed it in Seattle, and he's now working with the paediatricians in Fallujah. So, in fact, what is happening is America's contaminated the cradle of civilization for the rest of time with uranium, and the children play, of course, in the dust. They play in the destroyed tanks. Uranium's a heavy metal. It's excreted through the kidney. It causes acute nephritis. It's excreted in the semen, too, interestingly enough, which may be inducing the congenital anomalies, or else it's crossing a placenta to be teratogenic. Uranium decays to a series of daughters, one of which is radium, and we know about that because of the watchdial painters, and we know about it because of Madame Curie, who used to walk around with a little piece of it in her pocket and play with it, and her body was so radioactive when she died, she almost had to be buried in a radioactive waste dump. She almost glowed, and she died of aplastic anemia. Her daughter died of leukemia. This is an alpha emitter. We know radon is also a gas, which is a daughter of uranium. It decays to a series of daughters. And this is an alpha emitter, and one of the main causes of lung cancer now recognised within the United States, particularly up in the northeast where people have granite cellars. One of the other ones is polonium, and if you remember that man Litvinenko, who was a Russian who went to have afternoon tea at Claridge's, and someone dropped some polonium in his tea, and he developed acute radiation illness, became bald, and died within 2 weeks of acute radiation illness. So these are all nasty contaminants, and their natural background, and we know natural background induces about 30% of the cancers we already see. So when I debate with George Monbiot from The Guardian, and many journalists say, well, you know, we live with natural background radiation all the time, as if that's benign. It's not. It induces mutations. In fact, we all carry several hundred mutations for disease, cystic fibrosis, you know, diabetes. We know that. And we know there are about 2,600 genetic diseases now described. And in fact, I've just found out I carry a gene for hemochromatosis because my oldest son has just been diagnosed with it. So you just don't know what you carry until you meet with someone with a similar gene. Okay, so let's move on to nuclear power now. We all should be doing something about the military using these weapons. They're selling them all over the world. I just went to the factory in North Carolina where they make these depleted uranium weapons. It's called Aerojet. It's like looking at a gas oven manufacturer. Okay, so when the uranium is mined, and it takes a huge amount of fossil fuel to mine uranium, but don't forget nuclear power is clean, green and sustainable, produces no CO2. And I can't stand it when scientists lie. If we lied in medicine, we'd be damaging our patients and we would probably be deregistered. Thou shalt not lie. And the nuclear industry lies the whole time. And in fact puts its lies on NPR and in Scientific American and the New Yorker. And that's inappropriate now as we're facing very grave medical consequences of many of these technologies. So when uranium is mined with huge trucks half as big as this room, because I've seen them because we have a lot of uranium in Australia, then it's milled and crushed into very tiny fine powder. Then it's turned into uranium hexafluoride, which is a gas, and sent to Paducah, Kentucky, where they have a series of cascades of nickel plates with micropore holes, and the uranium hexafluoride is forced through, so on one side stays 238, it's a larger atom, and 235 collects over time with hundreds and hundreds of cascades till you get 3% uranium enriched, okay? Now this is very energy consuming, so it takes two 1,500 megawatt coal-fired plants to enrich the uranium. But don't forget nuclear power produces no global warming. And 93% of the CFC gas, which is banned under the Montreal Protocol because it damages the ozone, hence in Australia, 1 in 9 of us get malignant melanoma. I've had one on my back, and we're all at my age covered with SCCs and BCCs because we have virtually no ozone in the summer. The nuclear industry has been grandfathered out of the Montreal Protocol, so it uses the CFC gas to cool the pipes transporting this very hot, thermally hot uranium hexafluoride gas. And the pipes are old, they leak, and 93% of the CFC 114 in your country leaks from the uranium enrichment plant, and it's 20,000 times more potent as a global warmer than CO2. But it doesn't cause global warming. Now, these nickel plates have become very radioactive, and they've got hundreds of tons of the things, and they're thinking of recycling them in a law called below regulatory concern into children's teeth braces, hip replacements, belt buckles, jewellery, knives and forks, and furniture. And you only find out if they have, if the metal is radioactive, if at the scrap metal plant they actually have to, they have a Geiger counter and it goes mad, and they realise they've got radioactive waste there. At Bed Bath & Beyond, they found many of the boxes they put tissues in are radioactive. Okay, now when the uranium is mined, it's converted into a ceramic pellet the size of a piece of chalk, packed in a fuel rod, half an inch wide and 12 feet long, made of zirconium. And that's a very interesting metal, and I'll get to that in a minute. So when they do that, they take it to a reactor, nuclear power plant, and they pack 100 tons of uranium into the reactor core. And it's all submerged in water, and there are moderating rods of boron amongst the fuel rods. And as they're slowly removed, the whole 100 tons reaches critical mass, and the atoms start breaking apart in a random fashion, producing 200 new elements, all man-made, none of which existed before we fissioned uranium. This uranium becomes 1 billion times more radioactive when it fissions, and there's as much radiation in a reactor as that produced by 1,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs. Now, as these rods are pulled out, you get E equals mc squared. Tremendous heat is produced, which boils the water, which turns the turbine and turns into steam, that turns the turbine, which generates electricity. So all a nuclear power plant is designed to do is to boil water. Einstein said nuclear power is a hell of a way to boil water. It's like cutting a pound of butter with a chainsaw. And the reason it was developed is because you were making nuclear weapons like there was no tomorrow, and there may not be still. And so the Pentagon said, there was a psychologist in the Pentagon in 1952 who said it would be a good idea to develop peaceful nuclear power so people will relax more about the splitting of the atom. And I quoted that in my last New York Times article. Now, these reactors need 1 million gallons of water a minute from a lake or a river to keep them cool, and if they lose the cooling water, the whole thing melts down like happened at Fukushima, and I'll walk you through that in a minute. And the water is relatively radioactive. Routinely, reactors release radiation. It's just called routine releases. Don't worry about it, it's just routine. What do they release? They release tritium. Tritium is a really dangerous isotope. It gets through every substance except gold, so you can't prevent its escape. So each reactor releases 1 million picocuries of tritium a day. That's a lot. Now, tritium is an interesting atom, or yeah, it's an atom, because it combines with oxygen to form tritiated water. And if there's an inversion system near a reactor and you live near, the tritiated water in the fog goes straight through your skin. The skin lets nothing through, as we know, but tritium gets through. It also gets through by inhalation. It bioaccumulates in the food chain by orders of magnitude at each step. So people who live near reactors have tritiated apples, tritiated peaches, tritiated spinach, tritiated potatoes. And it's a very potent carcinogen. It's a soft beta. And this radiation is captured, because it's soft, in the tissues. It doesn't escape. And it causes brain tumours and cancers in every organ and quite severe congenital anomalies. The other things that get out are xenon, argon, and krypton. And I don't know if any of you use xenon as stimulation fusion scans, but I did in my CF patients. And these are called noble gases because they don't combine biochemically in the body. However, they are absorbed through the alveoli, and they're very fat soluble. So they tend to go to the fatty abdominal pad and the upper thighs where the gonads are located. And they're very high energy gamma emitters. So people living near reactors are having their gonads irradiated consistently, which is medically contraindicated because it will increase the incidence of genetic disease down the time track. Other elements escape, like carbon-14 and radioactive nitrogen and stuff. And they say it's just routine, don't worry. The Germans have just done a study, and the Germans are very precise. They've looked at 16 old reactors and children less than the age of 5 living within 5 kilometres or 2 miles of the reactors. These children have been found to have more than double the incidence of leukemia and a high incidence of cancer. The French have just done another study which duplicates and replicates those results. So we don't need to do any more studies. We know that children who are so radiosensitive living near reactors are at risk for developing malignancy. They all should be closed down, these reactors. In fact, the last reactor has just been closed in Japan. They had 54, and they're still turning their lights on. 20% of your electricity is generated by nuclear power, and you waste 28%. You don't need it. You don't need it. It's really about power for a certain group of deluded men, actually. Now, and I'm serious. And when the water goes back in the lake, of course, it's got tritium in it and all sorts of other nasty things. And once a year, they close it down and remove 30 tons of spent fuel rods, which is so radioactive, if you stand next to one, just one, you'll get a lethal dose of radiation within a few seconds and die of acute radiation illness like Litvinenko did. So these fuel rods have to be continually cooled in what they call spent fuel pools, which are often located on the top of the reactors, which is what happened in Fukushima. And so the spent fuel pools contain 2 to 30 times more radiation than in the reactor themselves. And you don't know where to put your radioactive waste, but Halliburton built a railway line through the centre of Australia. You know, Halliburton was run by your very famous Air Deputy President. What do you call him? Vice President. Cheney. Yeah. And we just allocated an Aboriginal tribal land next to the railway line as a radioactive waste dump. You can be sure almost certainly that my silly little Prime Minister called John Howard did a deal with your silly little President called George W. Bush that probably will be importing your radioactive waste, and you've got 70,000 tonnes of it, and you don't know where to put it. Okay, now, the radioactive waste, well, I'll talk about that in a minute. I will now get on to what happened at Fukushima and Chernobyl. I want first to present this book. It's put out by the New York Academy of Sciences, and it's edited by Alexei Yablokov, a lovely man, and 2 men called Nestorenko. For the first time, they translated 5,000 articles from the Russian literature, epidemiology, and its medical literature into English. And by now, over 1 million people have died as a result of Chernobyl. 1 million people. Of all sorts of things. It's found, we think, that cesium-137 concentrates in cardiac muscle and the endocrine glands, and children are getting heart failure and dying. There's a very high incidence of diabetes amongst these survivors, very high incidence of lenticular cataracts. Of course, cancer and leukemia is very high. Very severe congenital abnormalities. There are pictures of children here, like thalidomide babies, and if you want to see it, you can come up afterwards, but you know what thalidomide babies look like. There are homes full of these children around Chernobyl, such that we have never seen before in the history of pediatrics. This is not talked about by the nuclear industry, by the UN agencies. This is the biggest cover-up in the history of medicine. Because in 25 years, 1 million people dying, that's nothing, because these isotopes last for hundreds of years. And I will now point out this map of Europe. Could we have the house lights dim, please? So this is Europe, and there's Chernobyl. And one stupid man who is a specialist in hydroelectricity, not even nuclear, was in charge of the reactor that night and did a crazy experiment, pulled the fuel rods out too fast, and there was what they call an atomic excursion, like it reached critical mass, and there was an explosion, and the thing exploded. And he had 2 young offspring, or men working with him, and the control room filled with white powder, and he said to the 2 men, go outside and see what's happened. There was a big bang. And they came back and they said to him, it's gone. He said, what's gone? They said, the reactor's gone. He said, don't be ridiculous, go back and have another look. They subsequently died of acute radiation illness within the first 2 weeks. These red areas are exclusion zones where no one should live, but people do. Before the accident, all the children in Belarus pretty well were healthy. Now only 20% are healthy. They've got all sorts of maladies, but including a lot of leukemia. These yellow areas are quite high fallout areas, and in fact the radiation was first picked up in Sweden. Gorbachev denied what was happening for about 10 days, and that's what would happen with your Nuclear Regulatory Commission, who is there not to protect the safety of the people but to protect the safety of the nuclear power industry. They are paid for and financed by the nuclear industry, not us. And in the United Kingdom, there are over 300 farms whose lambs are so full of cesium-137 they can't be sold on the market. Cesium-137, and this is only the map of cesium fallout, not any of the other 200 isotopes, some of which have half-lives of seconds and some have half-lives. Iodine-129 has a half-life of 17 million years. Plutonium has a half-life of 24,400 years, and it's all over Europe. I don't buy European food because I don't know which food is radioactive and which is not, and this radiation will continue to exist for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and 40% of Europe is so contaminated. There are wild boar running around Germany so radioactive they almost glow in the dark because they eat mushrooms and truffles which bioconcentrate cesium. The reindeer are very radioactive because the lichen up here bioconcentrates cesium by orders of magnitude. So that's just an indication of what one stupid man in one nuclear reactor can do to contaminate a whole continent virtually for the rest of time. Okay, Fukushima. Before I do this, I'll have the house lights on again, and I'll walk you through various isotopes made, just 4 in reactors, as an indication of many more. Remember, 200 are made. One of them is I-131, we all know about that. And in fact, in Itate, a village, they've got a really high fallout after Fukushima. The government, in its wisdom in Japan, has looked at over 3,000 children. Over 1,000 have thyroid nodules. And that's in the first year. Now, from the Hiroshima and Nagasaki data, we expect to see a rise in leukemia 5 years later, and solid cancers don't start appearing for 15 years. Now, we know children are very radiosensitive, but a year is a very short incubation time for cancer, very short. They must have got a whopping dose. And of those over 1,000 with thyroid nodules, they're following them. The government's following them. They are not doing fine needle biopsies. They are not removing the nodules to see what the histology is, and if they're malignant, taking out the thyroid. They're following them. I mean, in medicine, I've never read anything like this before. Many of those children are destined to die. And that's the tip of the iceberg. In fact, freshwater fish were tested near Itate, and their radiation is 18,700 becquerels. A becquerel is a disintegration per second, and the Japanese government said you can't eat food that is measuring greater than 500 becquerels. So what you have to understand is that these radioactive elements bioconcentrate by orders of magnitude in the algae, crustaceans, little fish, big fish, us. And they poured so much radiation into the Pacific, they don't know how much, but Woods Hole from Massachusetts is examining the Pacific Ocean now. Up to 200 miles, 63% of the fish have cesium in them, just cesium. They're not even measuring the other isotopes. Your EPA is not measuring the fish that are caught on the West Coast, and they don't intend to. And you know, you eat salmon, and you eat tuna, and all the rest. I went to a sushi bar in New York the other day, and everyone was all glamorous and drinking their sakis and eating their sushi, and I said, where does the fish come from? Japan. Hillary Clinton signed a deal with the Japanese government that you would continue importing Japanese food. The Japanese are canning very radioactive food and sending it to developing countries. The rice is coming in radioactive, and the leafy vegetables and the mushrooms are very radioactive, and they're being fed to children. So radioactive iodine, we know about its half-life is 8 days, so it lasts about 10 weeks. Actually, after 3 Mile Island occurred, and many of you are too young to remember that, you might even not have been born. There was a meltdown there, and 3 Mile Island is 13 miles from Hershey's chocolates, and that's the richest dairying area in the United States, and the milk was so full of I-131, they powdered it, because I've got the data from the labs. I've got it from a whistleblower. They powdered the milk for 10 weeks till the I-131 decayed away to nothing, and then they used the milk for the chocolates. But huge amounts of radiation got out. We know not how much, because the radiation monitors went off scale within the first few minutes of the accident. Almost certainly strontium-90 lying around on those fields. Half-life 28 years. It's around for 600 years. It's a calcium analog, goes to bone, inducing osteogenic sarcoma and leukemia, and it's a beta and a gamma. Cesium-137 almost certainly got out. Half-life 30 years. It's around for 600 years. Beta and gamma. And so I tell people not to eat Hershey's chocolates, and I was in a debate with Ed Markey and a couple of other people a year after 3 Mile Island in Harrisburg in the town hall, and it was packed. And I said, don't eat Hershey's chocolates, and a woman came up from the town council, really angry, and she said, did you say that on purpose? I said, yes, I'm a doctor. So there's a big cover-up. There's more cover-up, but I haven't got time to go into that. So cesium is a potassium analog, and of course that's ubiquitous in the body. It induces brain tumours. Rhabdomyosarcomas. Hands up here, who's ever seen a rhabdo? Yeah, well, there was a meltdown at Brookhaven National Labs years ago, and I went to live on Long Island some years ago, and there were 19 children with rhabdos around that reactor. So obviously there's a lot of cesium in the environment. So I'm only mentioning a few. I mean, radioactive iodine, as I mentioned, 129, has a half-life of 17 million years. But the one I want to get to, and why they fissioned uranium in the first place, is this one, plutonium, named after the god of the underworld, appropriately so. It's said that at 10 to the minus 6 grams is carcinogenic, for sure. It's interesting, it's not absorbed well in the gut except in neonates because their gut's immature, or in chlorinated water, and much of our water is chlorinated. It is an alpha emitter, very potent carcinogen, half-life 24,400 years, so it's around for about 250,000 years. Not too long. I'm being sarcastic. Okay, So plutonium is fascinating because it's an iron analogue. And so if you inhale it, it goes to the lung, where, as I showed you before, it can induce lung cancer just with a tiny, tiny amount, a millionth of a gram. It's transferred by macrophages to the mediastinal lymph glands, where it can cause Hodgkin's and lymphoma. Of course, it's stored in the liver, where iron's stored, producing hepatocarcinoma. It, of course, goes to the bone, where hemoglobin's made, inducing either osteogenic sarcoma or leukemia. It crosses the placenta, which lets nothing pass, as we know, but because it's an iron analogue, it gets into the developing morula and fetus in the first trimester, inducing those malformations that I showed in this book, like thalidomide. And we used to have a bumper sticker in Australia which said plutonium is thalidomide forever. And it has a predilection for testicles. And every male in the Northern Hemisphere has a tiny load in his testicles from fallout from the weapons testing days, which is still coming down all the time from the stratosphere. And it deposits next to the spermatogonia, the precursors of the sperm, where it irradiates the genes to induce mutations, deleterious ones, passed on generation to generation. And if the man gets cremated, his smoke goes up the chimney, so another man can inhale the plutonium. So you can see, because of plutonium, there will be an exponential increase in genetic disease for the rest of time. Random compulsory genetic engineering, not just in humans, but all species which have genes. And I've got a friend who's a radiation biologist who, in fact, caused this to be published, and he goes into the exclusion zone at Fukushima and Chernobyl and looks at the birds. The birds have smaller than normal brains. Many of the males are sterile. There's a decrease in number of species and individuals within species. There are mutations of tail feathers, wings, of coloured and beaks, and the like. And he's seeing that in the insects too, and the spiders. Radioactive waste, I told you there are 70,000 tonnes only from civilian nuclear power. The waste from weapons is unbelievable. I've just been to Hanford, where they made all the plutonium for the bombs. They had 7 reactors there. In your time, you've made 77,000 hydrogen bombs, when 1,000 dropping on 100 cities will induce such firestorms, and I'll describe that in a while, that the whole Earth will be covered with a cloud so thick for up to 10 years it blocks out the sun, inducing a short ice age, and everyone and everything freezes to death in the dark. So you had 77 times more, greater the number of bombs to induce the end of life on Earth. So at Hanford, they've got 177 tanks full of bubbling hot, thermally radioactive waste leaking into the Columbia River, which was the most radioactive river in the world. It was like descending into Hades. I was there the other day. Now, this radioactive waste, there's no container you can put it in that will last longer than 100 years. Concrete cracks, steel rusts, everything decays. So within 100 years or less, this radioactive waste will start leaking and leaching into the water, and then bioaccumulating back in the food chain. So you can imagine generations hence waking up in the morning, and this is not an exaggeration. The breast milk already radioactive, the babies being already born deformed or with genetic disease, the food radioactive, and children getting cancer at 6 and not 60 because they're exposed in utero and early in life to radioactive elements. That's a legacy we are leaving so we can turn our lights on. And if you debate with the nuclear industry, you'll find they lie. And they scare me because I can't handle people who lie. And they're